We are talking about a defining collision of two political worlds today, folks. The moment JD Vance and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came face to face, delivering a masterclass in political reality that shattered the usual Washington theater. If you were watching the broadcast initially, you saw a scene we have all become incredibly familiar with over the last few years. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was mid-sentence, building toward that signature crescendo she always builds toward. Her hands were moving in that specific way they move when she knows every single camera in the room is catching the exact right angle. She was winning the room, and anyone watching the feed could plainly see she was winning. But then, something remarkable happened. JD Vance leaned into his microphone for the first time all morning, and he spoke just 7 words that caused the sentence she was building to completely collapse in her throat, falling apart like a house with its foundation suddenly pulled out from under it. To truly understand how those few words completely undid 40 minutes of what was arguably the most polished performance in modern American politics, we have to go back to the very beginning of the hearing, back to when she still believed he was not a threat worth watching. As a fellow politician, I can tell you that this hearing was not supposed to belong to JD Vance. It was entirely supposed to belong to her. She had actively pushed for this event. She had picked the location, and she had wanted Ohio specifically. She wanted to stand right there in the heart of the Rust Belt and tell the people of that region that she understood their plight. And for a while, she was doing exactly that. She was standing at a simple folding table inside a community college auditorium in Dayton, bathed in the glow of humming fluorescent lights, speaking to 200 people who had driven in from quiet towns that simply do not make the evening news anymore because nothing ever happens in them anymore. She looked out at them and said, "Let me be honest with you, and I have to admit, there was a genuine warmth in her delivery. It was real warmth, or at least something that sounded remarkably enough like warmth to fill up a room full of hard plastic chairs. She told them she knew the caricatures about the Green New Deal, but that she had come there because the people in that room deserved a real conversation about the future, about what happens next. She declared that she was bringing them a difficult truth that nobody running for office in Ohio wanted to say out loud. She looked them in the eye and said the steel mills are not coming back, the coal plants are not coming back, and the factory floors where their fathers and grandfathers worked are not being relaid. She acknowledged how incredibly hard that was to hear, especially in that city and that state. But then, she delivered the line she had undoubtedly practiced. She said that clinging to those old industries is like clinging to a typewriter in the age of the internet. She called it a beautiful machine, said she understood the nostalgia, but insisted that nostalgia is simply not an economic policy. She delivered this with the absolute confidence of someone delivering a difficult truth, the specific kind of confidence that comes from truly believing you are brave for saying the things that others simply will not say. Now, if she were in a committee room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by political staffers who shared her exact vocabulary and her zip code, that statement might have landed as an act of profound courage. But she was not in Washington. She was in Dayton, Ohio. And sitting right there in the 3rd row of that auditorium was a man wearing a jacket bearing a steel company logo on the breast pocket, a company that had long ceased to exist. As she spoke, his hands tightened on his knees, because the woman standing at the front of the room had just summarized the entire work of his adult life as a typewriter. For 30 full minutes, she held the absolute attention of that room. 2 other senators asked her detailed questions regarding clean energy investments and job retraining programs, and she answered them with the flawless fluency of a politician who had answered those exact questions 100 times before. She quoted relevant studies, she referenced specific legislation, and she was undeniably smart, prepared, and composed. And not once during that entire exchange did she bother to look down to the end of the table at the man who had not spoken a single word since the hearing gave its opening gavel. JD Vance sat there with his hands folded quietly over a small, cheap notebook, the kind you might buy at a gas station for $2, complete with a cardboard cover and a broken spine. He did not take a single note during her testimony, nor did he react to any of her polished answers. He just sat there. And let me tell you, as someone who has sat at those tables, he sat the way a man sits who has spent considerable time in places where sitting still is not merely an act of patience, but an act of strict discipline. It is the posture of someone who has learned to breathe at a steady rhythm that does not give away his position. The other politicians asked their questions, received their answers, shuffled their official papers, and Vance simply did nothing. Slowly, that nothing he was doing began to develop its very own weight in the room. Then, the chairman finally turned to him, and the silence ended. Vance leaned forward, not with a dramatic flourish, but just enough so that the microphone caught his subtle shift. "Congresswoman," he said quietly, "I want to start by agreeing with you." She turned to look at him, and you could see a brief flicker of something cross her face. Maybe it was surprise, or perhaps it was just that rapid mental recalibration that happens when a debater is fully braced for a punch but receives a handshake instead. He told her she was entirely right that the working class had been left behind, noting that he grew up right in the middle of that reality, so he had no intention of arguing with her about whether the problem actually existed. He nodded slowly and said he just wanted to ask her some small, very specific questions about it. She confidently agreed. Vance reminded her that she had just used the word relic and compared steel mills to typewriters right there in that room, in front of those specific people. He asked to clarify, "You are saying to Dayton, Ohio, that the steel industry is a typewriter." She shifted slightly, defending her point by stating the industry is changing, which is basic economics. But Vance did not let her pivot. He pointed out that she did not say changing. She explicitly used the words typewriter and relic. When she defensively claimed it was merely a metaphor, Vance replied that he heard it, and so did everybody sitting in the third row. He did not even need to look at the third row. He told her his question was not about metaphors at all. His question was fundamentally about respect. He pointed out that there was a man sitting right there in the audience whose hands bore steel mill scars that were actually older than her entire political career. And she had just casually called his lifelong profession a museum piece. So, Vance asked her directly, did she want to walk that word back, or did she stand by it? Instantly, the atmosphere of the room changed. It was not a loud shift, but rather the way a deep river changes when the underlying current suddenly shifts beneath the surface, leaving the water looking the same but feeling entirely different. True to form, she did not walk it back. That has always been the defining trait about her, the very thing her fervent supporters love and her harshest critics can never forgive. She never walks things back. She proudly stood by the reality that economies evolve and stated that workers deserve a just transition. Vance nodded and calmly accepted her premise. Okay, so let us talk about the just transition. Real specific. He asked her, when a manufacturing plant closes and a worker suddenly loses their job, exactly how long does their COBRA health coverage last? There was a half-beat of silence. It was not long enough for a casual observer to notice, but it was just long enough for anyone listening closely to feel the hesitation. She simply did not know the specific answer. She attempted to pivot again, arguing that the duration of COBRA is less important than why healthcare is tied to employment in the first place. But Vance refused to let her escape the specific reality. He cut in and provided the answer. 18 months, assuming they can even afford the massive premiums, which average about $1,700 a month for a family. He noted that most newly unemployed workers absolutely cannot pay that. As she tried to interrupt to push her broader systemic talking points, Vance kept going. He did not get louder. His tone just got steadier. He explained the harsh reality. After 18 months, if that worker is under 65, they fall into a brutal coverage gap. They are too young for Medicare, far too broke to afford private insurance, yet technically too high income to qualify for Medicaid in many states. He looked at her and asked, what is your specific plan for that exact gap? Not the grand visionary plan, not the eloquent campaign speech, but the concrete plan for that specific person facing that gap next month. She straightened up and declared that her proposal of Medicare for all would eliminate that gap entirely. Vance immediately countered, reminding her that Medicare for all does not even have the necessary votes to pass out of her own committee. He pressed her again on what she tells the person falling into the gap right now, next month. He told her not to talk to the cameras, but to tell them. Leaning into the microphone, she proclaimed that she tells them she is fighting every single day to build the system that would ultimately protect them. Vance tilted his head just slightly, in that specific way a dog does when it hears a completely unrecognizable sound. Fighting to build, he repeated. He pointed out that those are future tense words. He painted a vivid picture of a woman losing her coverage in 30 days. A woman who relies on a monthly prescription for a medical condition she certainly did not choose to have. He coldly reminded the Congresswoman that the local pharmacy absolutely does not accept fighting to build as a valid form of payment. He asked what she is supposed to do on day 31. She passionately responded that this woman should not have to face that terrible choice, which was precisely the point she was trying to make. Vance countered instantly that regardless of what should be, she does face it, right now, today, in that specific zip code, and probably right inside that very room. 4 rows back, a woman shifted awkwardly in her seat, the plastic chair creaking loudly into the sudden silence of the auditorium. The congresswoman pressed her lips tightly together. As an observer, it was clear she was simply not used to this specific kind of fight. She was highly accustomed to high-altitude debates, 30,000 feet in the air, where the political view is crisp and clean, and the messy human details look incredibly small. But Vance was dragging her forcefully down to ground level, directly to the unforgiving place where sweeping federal policy collides violently with a worn kitchen table, a towering stack of unpaid bills, and a crucial bottle of pills bearing a price tag that literally makes your hands shake. She clearly did not possess a political map for navigating that rugged terrain. The silence stretched out long enough that a man sitting in the back row exhaled heavily through his nose, a small human sound that the room's acoustics amplified. It was not an expression of boredom, it was the distinct sound a person makes when they have lived their entire life inside a painful question, only to watch a powerful leader completely fail to answer it. It was the deafening silence of a politician facing a real-world problem that a polished white paper cannot solve, but that someone who has actually lived through it could answer in 4 flat seconds. But she is a fighter, and she did what she has always done best. She abandoned her defensive posture and aggressively went on the offensive. And folks, when she plays offense, it is truly something to behold. She sarcastically admired his debate technique of asking small questions to avoid the big answers, and then she launched her counterattack. She brought up his best-selling book about poverty in Ohio, noting how Hollywood turned it into a movie and how he made a substantial amount of money from it. She pointed out that he then moved away to San Francisco, went to work for the billionaire venture capitalist Peter Thiel, and personally invested in the very tech companies that are actively replacing the working-class jobs he had just written about. She turned directly to the audience, expertly finding her lighting like a seasoned performer. She asked the room to consider whether Senator Vance, while sitting in those lucrative San Francisco boardrooms, was actually thinking about his hometown of Middletown every single day, or if he only started thinking about it when he suddenly needed to run for political office. She contrasted that by declaring that for 6 years in Congress, she has shown up every single day and fought relentlessly for everyday people who cannot afford expensive lobbyists. Where was the senator? She demanded. San Francisco. And you could feel that counterpunch land perfectly in the room. A few audience members nodded in agreement, and a young woman even clapped briefly before stopping herself. The momentum in the room shifted wildly, and for a fleeting moment, it belonged entirely to her. You could see the realization make her stand just a bit taller, and her renewed confidence made the room believe in her just a little bit more. Vance did not physically react. 2 seconds passed. 3. Then he calmly said, "Congresswoman, you are right." The room completely paused again. He openly admitted that he went to San Francisco and sat in those wealthy boardrooms. But then he shared a specific memory of eating dinner at a high-end restaurant where the total bill was more than his mother had earned in an entire week. He paused heavily and added, "When she was still earning." Those tragic words hung heavy in the air. Nobody needed him to finish the thought, because everybody understood exactly what had happened to his mother. He described looking down at his expensive plate and thinking deeply about his grandmother's modest kitchen back in Middletown, eating red beans and rice not because it was a trendy choice, but simply because it was all they had. He locked eyes with her and stated that the very next week, he started packing his boxes and moved back home. He clarified that he didn't do it because he was some inherently noble person, but because he simply could not stomach the massive distance anymore. Then, his voice shifted dramatically. It did not get louder, but a profound coldness crept into it, spreading slowly and then all at once, like winter frost creeping across a pane of glass. He answered her direct accusation. No, he was not thinking about Middletown every single day. But, he noted, he did eventually go back. Then came the absolute hammer blow. He wondered aloud if, when she left the exclusive Met Gala at midnight in September 2021, wearing a custom designer gown emblazoned with "Tax the Rich" at a lavish party that cost $35,000 just for a ticket to attend, she was actually thinking about the Bronx, or if she was just thinking about the perfect social media caption. A highly distinct sound rippled through the auditorium. It wasn't laughter. It was something much sharper, the collective, sudden inhale of 200 people simultaneously hearing a brutal sentence they were absolutely not expecting. It was the sound a room makes when someone finally says out loud the very thing everyone had privately thought but politely filed away. The infamous image of that Met Gala dress was instantly projected into their minds. Vance did not need to elaborate on it. Just saying the word caption lit up the entire cultural memory of the stark white dress, the bold red letters, the flowing champagne, and the self-described democratic socialist, happily smiling in the absolute center of elite wealth. The debate had now hurtled far past basic policy disagreements and past simple biography. It was now operating deep in the sensitive territory of personal identity, a political terrain she typically masters better than almost anyone. Vance kept his voice low but pressed harder. He noted her constant claims of being from the Bronx. He acknowledged she was indeed born there, but pointed out the public record shows her family moved away to the affluent Yorktown Heights when she was only 5 years old. He stated she attended Yorktown High School in wealthy Westchester County. She fired back rapidly, fiercely defending her family. She stated her mother painstakingly cleaned houses in Yorktown, specifically so she could attend those better schools, and that her family had pooled their meager resources to afford a small house there. She angrily told him she did not need him auditing her childhood address. Vance calmly replied he wasn't auditing her address, he was simply asking a question about her claimed expertise. He asked her, when she confidently tells the room that she fundamentally understands the working-class life, which specific experience is she drawing from? Is she drawing from Yorktown Heights, a place boasting a 95% high school graduation rate, or is she drawing from somewhere else? She accused him of gatekeeping poverty, demanding to know if he thought there was only one acceptable kind of hardship. Vance clarified that while there are many kinds of hardship, her specific brand, the girl from the Bronx, simply did not match the reality of growing up in Yorktown Heights. He stated clearly that he respected her mother's hard work, but he was talking directly about her and the political brand she had carefully constructed. He painted the timeline. She moved from the Bronx at age 5, attended a highly funded suburban high school where she went by the name Sandy, and then went off to Boston University. He pointed out that somewhere between her suburban upbringing and her first slick campaign video, Sandy strategically transformed back into Alexandria from the Bronx, and the public was simply not supposed to notice the vast distance between those two realities. The exchange turned blindingly fast, a pure, unscripted back and forth. It was the raw rhythm of two powerful figures who had entirely stopped performing for the cameras and were now truly confronting one another. The audience watched in total silence, the exact way a crowd intensely watches two fighters who have stopped circling and finally moved to the center of the ring. And then, Vance did something masterful. He just stopped. He stopped talking about the Bronx and Westchester. He looked right past her, gazing out at the rows of faces in the crowd, and lowered his voice to a level that forced the entire room to lean in and quiet down with him. He told her he didn't actually care where she grew up. He cared about something far more vital. He told the room about calling his 6-year-old son the night before. His son had asked him what he was doing, and upon hearing his father was going to speak to a congresswoman, the little boy asked a simple, profound question: "Does she help us?" Vance turned back to her and admitted he simply did not know what to tell his son. He stated that when his boy grows up in Ohio, he wants him to live in a nation where political representatives actually know the true cost of health insurance, not because they skimmed a staffer's briefing paper, but because they have personally had to agonize over choosing between paying for their health or paying to keep the lights on. That, he declared, is the meaningful difference he is talking about. The room was utterly motionless. The man sitting in the third row hadn't moved an inch, but his jaw was firmly set in a new way. Beside him, an older woman looked at the congresswoman with an expression that wasn't quite anger, but a profound recognition, the look of someone who has finally seen the clear outline of a truth they had long suspected but never fully confirmed. But she was not done yet, and as an analyst of the game, I have to give her credit where it is absolutely due. Her next move was her strongest moment of the entire morning, and frankly, it almost worked. She visibly reorganized her posture, calling upon something old, highly practiced, and genuinely earned. The slick performance fell away entirely. What remained standing there was a fiercely dedicated woman who truly believed in the words she was saying. She sharply criticized him for dragging his young children into a political hearing, claiming she respects the strict boundary between family and politics. But, she challenged, if he wanted to discuss the future of the next generation, She was ready. Her voice grew incredibly steady and certain. She reminded the room that before she arrived in Congress, absolutely nobody in that Capitol building was aggressively talking about the crushing costs of childcare or student debt relief or placing strict price caps on insulin. She proudly declared that she was the one who forced those issues onto the legislative table. She told Vance he could dislike how she talks, where she grew up, or even the controversial dresses she wears. But when you search for the insulin price cap legislation, you will find her name stamped on it, not his. Then, she delivered a line that nearly ended the entire debate. She looked right at him and said, "You wrote a book about the problem. I wrote laws about the problem. Books sit on shelves. Laws change people's lives. So who is sitting down with them, Senator?" The entire room tilted in her favor. It was a brilliant rhetorical maneuver. She had taken his entire working-class framework, the very architecture he had methodically built all morning, and completely flipped it on its head. And she had a very valid point. The insulin caps and child care bills were real, tangible things. She put her genuine legislative record right on the table and blatantly dared him to match its weight. Staffers nodded vigorously, someone in the back began to clap, and the momentum swung entirely back to her. For 5 agonizingly long seconds, Vance just sat there. This time, his stillness did not look like tactical patience. It looked like a desperate man frantically trying to find a handhold on a massive wall he had not realized was quite so steep. He was quiet for so long that the room genuinely began to settle into the collective realization that she had decisively won the exchange. You could literally see her posture relax half an inch, exactly the way a confident boxer drops their shoulders when they know they've secured the round. But then, Vance nodded slowly, mirroring the way he had agreed with her at the very beginning, and the audience instinctively felt the tension roar back into the room. He conceded the point. He admitted she was completely right about insulin and praised her for putting the vital issue on the table. He let that major concession breathe in the air for a moment. Then he leaned forward and executed the checkmate. He repeated her own powerful words back to her. "Books sit on shelves, laws change lives." He enthusiastically agreed with her standard, but then asked her to measure her own record against it. He pointed out she introduced the sweeping Green New Deal way back in 2019. It is 2024 now. Has it become law? Her eyes immediately narrowed defensively as she tried to explain the sluggish legislative process. He talked right over her, simply repeating, "Has it become law?" She blamed partisan obstruction. "Has it become law, Congresswoman?" he demanded again. She quietly admitted, "No." He didn't stop. "Medicare for all?" Silence. "The federal jobs guarantee?" Silence. "The $15 federal minimum wage she so heavily championed?" Silence. Vance let that heavy silence stretch out. He did not jump in to fill it. He intentionally let every single working-class voter in that room count up her high-profile proposals in their own heads and arrive at the stark reality entirely on their own, because he knew that a conclusion a voter reaches by themselves is a conclusion they will firmly believe. He calmly told her he wasn't trying to embarrass her, acknowledging that some of her proposals were actually good ideas. But he held her strictly to the very ruler she had just slammed on the table. She had claimed her laws change lives, while his book just sits on a shelf. So, measuring by her exact standard, where did they actually stand? She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped completely, realizing there was absolutely no rhetorical turn she could make that didn't lead straight into a dead end. Vance delivered the final blow. He stated proudly that his book is indeed on a shelf, having sold over 3 million copies. But her grand laws? He paused. They are on shelves, too. The same shelf, right next to my book. A deep, profound sound resonated through the auditorium. It wasn't a gasp. It was the heavy sound of a massive truth finally settling into its rightful place, like the distinct click of a stuck key finally turning in a stubborn lock. Vance looked directly at her and delivered a closing thought that felt incredibly natural, arriving only because the brutal current of the debate had carried them both to it. He told her the real difference between them wasn't about who wrote what. The real difference was that he fully knew his book didn't actually change anything, which is exactly why he moved back home, ran for office, and was currently sitting in that room. He accused her of believing she has changed the world simply because she has given a lot of passionate speeches about changing the world. Speaking and doing are two different things, he concluded, noting that everyone in that room intimately knows the difference because they have to live it every single day. Nobody clapped, and nobody laughed. The impact bypassed all the usual political noise and sank deep into the quiet part of the room where real voters make their permanent decisions. The man in the third row finally unclenched his scarred hands, laying them flat on his knees, the profound gesture of a man who had waited his entire life to hear a politician finally say exactly that. And then, it happened. She attempted to regain control. She opened her mouth and started to speak with the exact same confident words she has used to start 10,000 sentences on the House floor and 100 viral live streams. "Senator, she began. She got exactly 2 words out. And on that second word, her seemingly invincible voice completely cracked. It was not a dramatic sob, nor was it a choke. It was a clean, thin fracture. Exactly like the sudden crack that tears through a pane of glass when the temperature outside changes entirely too fast. Her vocal cords inexplicably tightened, the words split completely in half, and the microphone broadcasted that exact moment of vulnerability to all 200 people sitting in the dead-still air of the auditorium. Everyone understood instantly what it meant. She stopped, took a breath, and bravely tried one more time. She said, desperately reaching for the remainder of her thought, like a person blindly grabbing for a handrail in the pitch dark. But the fracture returned in the exact same place. It was as if the invincible political persona she had meticulously built over the years, the persona that had carried her victoriously through every room in Washington, the persona that never once ran out of sharp retorts, suddenly decided, right there in front of an audience of forgotten Ohio voters, that it simply did not want to speak anymore. The tragic part was not what she actually said, but what her own throat absolutely refused to let her say. As we all know, she has been aggressively shouted down on the House floor, she has been interrupted in countless committee hearings, and she has been endlessly mocked on conservative cable news. She has faced intense vitriol, but none of those external forces had ever successfully stopped her voice. She had built a monumental career on the absolute certainty that her voice would never fail her. It was her primary weapon and her ultimate proof of political existence. In 6 years of highly public life, it had never once refused to perform. But this moment was fundamentally different. This wasn't an opponent aggressively silencing her. This was her own body shutting down before her incredibly sharp mind could override it. Her body recognized that there were absolutely no words left that could alter the undeniable reality that had just settled over the room. The final verdict hadn't been delivered by a judge or a formal floor vote, but by 200 people sitting in cheap plastic chairs, people who had just watched a powerful politician from New York casually reduce their entire life's labor to an obsolete typewriter, and then spectacularly fail to explain how they were supposed to survive on day 31. The chairman politely waited 3 agonizing seconds before gently asking if she wished to respond. She just shook her head once. By the time the hearing officially concluded, the viral clip was already circulating the internet. But the defining moment people shared was not the sharp line about speaking versus doing. It was the devastating 2 seconds of audio where her voice broke, played on an endless loop, aggressively juxtaposed with a fiery clip from 6 months prior where she stood triumphantly on the House floor and loudly declared, "I will not be silenced." It was the exact same voice, the exact same woman, but the massive distance between those 2 rooms was the profound difference between performing on a political stage and dealing with actual life. And the 200 working-class people in Dayton had just watched her brutally discover exactly which one she was currently standing on. As the auditorium cleared, the older man from the third row did not immediately drive home. He sat quietly in his parked car, the engine completely off, resting his scarred hands on the steering wheel, the exact same hands that possessed 30 years of brutal labor history that had just been casually dismissed as a relic. He stared at those hands for a long time. Then, he picked up his phone and called his son. He didn't say a single word about the intense political drama, the viral moments, or the high-level policy debate. He simply asked, "How's the boy doing?" His son replied that the grandson was doing fine. "Good," the man said, and he just sat there staring out the windshield into the vast parking lot of a quiet community college before finally turning his key. The truth is, folks, the difference between merely talking about everyday people and truly knowing them is exactly the distance between a glamorous political stage and a lonely, quiet parking lot. Meanwhile, JD Vance exited quietly through a side door. There were no flashing cameras, no shouting reporters crowding the hallway. He simply folded up that cheap, broken-spined notebook and slid it into his pocket. It had sat open in front of him all morning, yet he had never once read from it, because everything he needed to say that day didn't come from any written notes. It came directly from his drive into town, his drive back home, and all the hard years he spent in between. He walked alone across the lot, past rows of dusty pickup trucks and old minivans, and nobody even turned to stare at him, because in places like Ohio, people don't stare at their neighbors. He started his engine, pulled out into the steady afternoon traffic heading in the exact same direction as everyone else, and from behind, he looked exactly like any other guy just trying to get home after a very long day.